Welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today. Top 5 metrics to consider when building a more effective third-party risk program. Featuring Alastair Parr and Joe Toley. Alastair and Joe are accredited third-party auditors and consultants, and over the years they've helped hundreds of customers mature their TPRM programs. My name is Peter Schumacher. I'm your webinar host for the day. I've got a couple housekeeping items to cover before we get started officially. So first of all, this is a reminder that all attendee lines are muted. We do that in an effort to cut down on background noise, especially with many of us working from our home offices. In an effort to keep this session interactive, we do invite you to submit your questions using the live Zoom console. Time permitting, at the end of the hour, we'll address those questions in an official Q&A session. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we plan to deliver that recording to your inbox by tomorrow. I know you didn't join to hear my voice, so at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Alastair and Joe. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and Alastair, please take it away.
Thank you very much for driving that introduction there, Peter. Very much appreciate it. So, thank you all for joining us. Just to briefly recap, we'll just cover off a few more housekeeping items. I think Peter has kindly covered most of them for us. We're going to talk a fair bit today about maturity assessment, specifically what is a maturity assessment for third-party management programs, why do we use the term third-party rather than vendor, and then cover off some of the key metrics and observations we've seen from enacting that on the field. We will have a Q&A section at the end, so to recap, if you have any questions, please feel free to fire them our way via the Q&A option in Zoom, and we'll endeavour to answer them as we go along or at the very end of the session. We do have 1 hour today. And you do have your hosts, so it's myself, Alastair Parr. A brief bit of insight so you understand who I am and why I'm suitable to talk to you about this issue. I've been dealing with third-party risk programs for the best part of 15 years, focused very much on governance and implementation. Done a lot of work around ISO 27001, auditing, business continuity, and so on. And we also have Joe Toley with us here. Joe.
Thank you, and hi everyone. So my background is mainly around data and recently conducting third-party maturity assessments. So I'm responsible internally for heading up our services team. And in addition to that, making sure we customize our platform to give clients the best use of the system and some of its features and functionality.
Thank you very much, Joe. So let us begin. Maturity assessment overviews. The most common question we naturally get up front is, what is a third-party program maturity assessment? So for us, if we just cover off the metrics, what makes up a good third-party maturity assessment, we normally use the CMM model, so the Carnegie Capability Maturity Model, which, for those of you who are familiar with it, rates things between a 1 and a 5, between initial, as in there's not much progress, it's very immature, up to 5 being optimized. Now, the thing about the Carnegie Capability Maturity Model is that it's extremely rare, if near enough impossible, to get to a level 5. So when we actually assess organizations here, we normally expect them to ambitiously aim for a 3 or a 4, usually within 12 months of actually conducting their program. Now, what is the maturity assessment actually trying to achieve? Is it's really looking at the broader capabilities of the third-party program. It looks at governance. It looks at a couple of key pillar areas, which we will cover off. But the objective of it really is to ascertain across scope, coverage, maturity from governance, audit, the depth of detail, to ascertain how mature is the organization in managing the program, and does it integrate with the broader strategies. So why should I actually care what a third-party maturity program is going to tell me? Is that it is a regular checkpoint. It is going to give you a benchmark compared to peers and across industries, verticals, and of course internally, as to how effective your program currently is. Now, it is a measure of success. Now, there isn't a pass or fail, of course, when you're doing a maturity assessment. It's just simply a benchmark and states, what do we need to do in order to become in our tolerance level? You know, what do we need to do to actually achieve what we aim to do, what we aspirationally want to hit within a set time frame? And it's really just an opportunity to identify what can we be doing better. So a common misconception that we experience when we're doing these maturity assessments for different organizations is the fact that people try to game the system. They try and say the answers that they expect the inquisitor or the auditor to ask for, when the reality is that's not going to help anyone. We always rather people be honest, direct, and it helps us identify what the challenges are so we can drive that program moving forwards. And then, of course, when we actually know where we are, it becomes a milestone for moving forward. So a milestone for understanding what remedial actions we can take, what net new programs need to be implemented as part of our third-party management workflow, and where there may be some additional deficiencies that we can either accept or tolerate based on budget, our risk tolerance, etc. So you see on the right-hand side, we normally see organizations hit around the 2 to 3 mark if they have an existing process. And that 2 to 3 mark is usually commensurate with the fact that they'll have a technology, they've implemented some processes, they have accountable resources internally for driving third-party risk, etc. But the aspirational view is that you'd be able to go up normally around a 1 in the maturity score within a 12-month period. So we're going to cover off some of the key areas of a maturity assessment shortly, but just to give you a bit of insight up front, our key coverage areas include content. So what are we actually identifying in our third-party management program? Coverage. So how broadly are we identifying that across our estate? Is it a subset? Is it the entirety? Roles and responsibilities. Do we have the right resources doing the right activities as part of that, that workflow? Remediation. Once we've found these issues, what are we actually going to do with it? And then finally, governance. So from a governance standpoint, do we educate and inform the right people in the business? And are we articulating the right mechanisms and metrics that help us ascertain if we're moving in the right direction? Now, the good thing about maturity assessment is that it doesn't really matter whether you're a Goliath of industry or relatively in your infancy when it comes to a third-party program. There is always something of value. Now, that could be as basic as building the foundational blueprints of a third-party management program, or of course, evolving it and expanding your reach, coverage, etc. So what are the key factors in the assessment approach before we move on to the broader scope? A third-party maturity program needs to be repeatable. So whether you leverage the prevalent maturity assessments or build your own or another technology or another provider, it needs to be a repeatable process. So it needs to be objective rather than subjective. So in that sense, we need to be asking the same questions time over time to ascertain if things are evolving or not. We, of course, need to get those honest responses to reinforce that point. That is something I will hammer home multiple times over the course of today. Honesty is a key factor. The amount of times we've had to reject maturity assessments and politely guide people to adjust some of their answers based on reality. It happens far more often than we'd like. We recommend having a consistent audience and scope of response. So in this case, it's about having the right audience. An interesting fact is quite often we do maturity assessments with 2 different tiers of resource in the organization. We can do a maturity assessment with the practitioners actively working on the project day to day, and we can do a maturity assessment with the stakeholders and the sponsors. And invariably, we tend to find they actually vary. The stakeholders, sponsors tend to think that the program is performing better than they'd expect, and the practitioners are obviously more aware of the various warts that emerge out of the program and articulate as such. So it's worth noting that a consistent audience means you're going to capture a similar perspective. Now, whether you want to be able to take the sponsor stakeholder view or the practitioner view, that's of course your prerogative, but we'd recommend sticking to one of the 2. Now, the clear and binary approach for identifying weaknesses, again, we remove any interpretation here. It should be a case of when we ask any maturity-based questions, it should be a yes, no, or a checkbox or definitive statement that they can select. It shouldn't be an interpretive-based question set. And once we've done that, we can then standardize what the scoring mechanism is. And then we can, of course, prioritize accordingly based on the business appetite. And we'll talk about how we can actually prioritize different criteria over the course of today. So the next view, which is actually assessment scope. Now, I've covered this briefly, but we're just going to go through each of these and just highlight really what we're looking for when we go through each of these. So each of these pillars, normally we would have a rating between 1 to 5 for. So that's that maturity rating of 1 to 5. And then we take out an overall program maturity from this. Now, a common mistake that we see when people are building their maturity assessments is that they will weight these areas equally, or they'll weight the questions within those areas equally. Now, that's a bit of a faux pas. And the reason being is that you may actually want to focus on particular questions more than others. They may be heavily weighted. So we recommend if you are building your own or leveraging one, that you do check that the questions are weighted appropriately based on your vertical or your risk tolerance or interpretation. So again, just to reiterate, coverage. So how comprehensive is the scope? Do we cover the entirety of our third-party estate? Do we extend to fourth parties or even fifth parties? Do we only have our tier ones or priority vendors covered? Content is, are we purely looking at information security? Are we looking just at business continuity and resilience? Are we capturing legal requirements? Are procurement involved in the conversation? Do we have privacy involved in the conversations? Is this broader gamut of requirements that you normally wish to capture from a third party is what we view at content. So is it limited to a particular perspective? Do we amalgamate the different requirements of the business together? And then what do we actually do with it? So the roles and responsibilities piece is, do we have individuals accountable for different activities in the platform? So do we have, for example, practitioners responsible for capturing the data? Do we have an analyst looking at the results? Do we have governance defined? So from a governance standpoint, do we actually have stakeholders, steering committees set up with the business? And then do they drive that remediation process? So do we have risk tolerance levels defined? How do we actually drive that level of remediation? And then how do we report all that back? So the metrics for governance, KPIs, reporting back. And we'll touch on some of the common deficiencies and challenges we see as we go through that. And just to highlight, I didn't lie, I'm going to hammer this point home multiple times, that while the maturity assessment is fun to win, it isn't a game. So we do recommend you be honest and fair to yourself, so that as you improve over the course of your program, that's demonstrated in some of the results. Okay, so we're going to go through some of the pillars now. And Joe, I wondered if you'd be happy to cover off the coverage for us, please.
Of course, thank you very much. So some of the key considerations for the coverage pillar of maturity is firstly getting an understanding of how comprehensive your current scope of the program is. How many of your third parties do you know about, and how confident are you about that particular number? So performing an exercise to actually try and understand what information you have internally about a third party or about your entire third party scope is hugely valuable to determining how well you're assessing each of the potential entities that could be exposing risk to your organization. We often find that the scope of third parties is usually reduced because of poor onboarding processes. So one thing we would highly recommend is investing some time into looking at your onboarding process to make sure that if there are third parties the business units are engaging with, there is a fit for purpose process to inform the program owner that there's a new third party to onboard, so the relevant gates of onboarding a third party can be taken. Without that sufficient and mature onboarding process, there's always going to be a risk that there are holes in the program and obviously third parties that could potentially go unmanaged. As part of that onboarding process, there are a few things that should be incorporated to ensure that you are acting in the most mature way possible. One of those aspects being profiling. We commonly see that third parties are purely assessed using assessment content, but there's not a sufficient amount of time and investment in actually finding out what that third party does for the organization, logging it so they can keep a track record of it, making sure they're aware of key attributes that might influence the assessment process, like where they're operating from, what type of service are they providing, what's the scale of the organization, do they interact with personal data or any form of sensitive or intellectual property, for example. So some of those key aspects around attributes of how a third party is delivering a service can be hugely beneficial, not just from a reporting standpoint, but also when it comes to maintaining and making sure you're assessing them in the right way. There can be a huge amount of context gained when it comes to the remediation approach because you know that type of information up front. And without trying to get this information up front and as part of that onboarding process, it can be a real struggle to pick up that type of data later on. As part of onboarding a third party, we're often pushing clients towards rolling out a tiering-based approach. This is a way of classifying the criticality of a third party based on some of those key attributes that we just discussed. What we have found is that clients might be tiering third parties based on the type of data they hold. Of course, that is one aspect, but what we recommend is looking at a few different areas to understand what the real impact of that third party would be on your organization if they were to fail in the performance or delivery of the service. So being able to understand some key attributes in order to measure how critical a third party is to your business. Some of those attributes might be data, but also it could be that they expose some reputational damage, some financial damage, or even operational damage, which could be, of course, very significant and something that's overlooked. We often find, and this is probably one of the most key areas that third-party programs fall down when it comes to onboarding processes, and that's looking at the extended third parties or fourth parties, or as we reference here, nth parties within the program. So these are third parties of your third parties. They're the ones that might be supporting a third party service that they provide to you. It could be a data center, for example. What we're commonly finding is that if you begin to map out some of these fourth parties that might be providing a service to your third parties, you can in fact find some commonality there. There could be multiple third parties you utilize which are really critical to you, all being stood up by the same fourth party provider. That of course exposes another area of potential risk and a potential bottleneck if there was the event of a failure from that fourth party. So far we've looked at identifying third parties, making sure we capture the right information, classifying them correctly, and of course finding out any of that additional information around extended third party scope. What we haven't touched on yet is third party maintenance. This is a real big one to hammer home. There's not a lot of clients that we see do this. It's making sure there is a process in place to revisit each third party on a regular basis. And of course, this could be something you determine based on the tiering or classification of a third party to you. But the process should be there to make sure that all of the above information on those top 4 bullet points there are reviewed. You have a process in place to make sure contact information is the same, the type of service hasn't changed, their criticality to the business hasn't changed, and some of those key attributes that might influence your assessment process as well have not changed. And if they have, you're able to make that change to how they're assessed or how they're reviewed and remediated internally.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
So some common observations that we normally see specifically around coverage is that a vast percentage here, so 79% of the organizations we deal with do not consider fourth party risk. So they'll stop at that third party space. Now that for us is perfectly understandable because we appreciate that it's very, very rare for us to actually engage with an organization who has actually done the necessary due diligence and requirements across their third party estate. So naturally, why would they have evolved to their fourth parties when they haven't had the bandwidth? And usually at the point where they have actually assessed everybody and captured the information they need, it's ready to start again and repeat that process. But there is a commonality, and Joe did mention this, which is out of the people that have actually considered fourth party risk, we have seen quite often concentration risk where the same fourth party is being used by multiple third parties. Now, I appreciate in some cases this might be an acceptable tolerance, particularly when you're dealing with cloud providers like AWS and Azure, but equally so, there may be a reliance across some of your critical providers that would have a detrimental impact to the business downstream. So we do recommend at the very least, if you look at some of your most critical providers that enable you to generate revenue in whatever it is that you may be doing, that you just investigate and just identify if there's any concentration risks to consider. Now that concentration risk may actually be a positive for you for your third party estate when you have different parts of the business using the same vendor and you haven't necessarily consolidated your contracts into a master services agreement, and there's an opportunity to actually, funny enough, save money and get money back from your third party program rather than being seen as an insurance expense. But generally looking at concentration risk for fourth parties, we do recommend looking at least a subset of your tier ones. Joe, would you like to educate us a bit on content, if you don't mind?
Sure.
Thank you.
One of the common pitfalls we're finding as well through working with our clients is the lack of a standardized assessment framework when building out an approach to assessing third parties. Commonly what we're finding is there is a survey of some form, it's being sent out to some third parties and capturing data. What clients aren't doing, and certainly what we're pushing them towards doing now to mature this particular area, is building out a playbook of how to assess each third party based on some of the information we learned from the onboarding process. So if, for example, we know they handle sensitive data or we understand that they're a tier 1 third party, maybe we could standardize what happens next. So if they're a tier 1, perhaps there's a requirement for an on-site visit. Maybe we need to see evidence of penetration tests that have taken place. Maybe there's a lower threshold in which we're willing to accept risks. So building out that if this then that type standardized approach to identifying what a survey or what an assessment requirement is will certainly help standardize that process. It's, as I said, it's something we haven't seen incorporated too much to date, but certainly there's some room for defining that sort of logic, provided you have the profiling and onboarding information up front. Another pitfall we're seeing with third-party programs is the lack of a developed and mature process for managing survey content or assessment content. The reason being, quite commonly, is that an assessment or a question set is in place. Maybe there's been changes of roles, etc. And throughout the years, the questionnaire itself hasn't really migrated or been enhanced or kept up to date. And as I said, that's usually because there's some historic reason for why it was invented in the first place. It covers all the bases, so there was never a need to review it. We would certainly recommend putting a particular representative in charge or accountable for managing that type of questionnaire content to ensure it covers the right basis from a regulatory standpoint and a coverage standpoint based on some of those profiling attributes that we understand. There are a few techniques as well that we are recommending to clients to introduce into survey content as they're rolled out. We often see free text fields within questionnaire content, yes, no, partial type responses. All of these capture information, but they leave a lot of room for error when it comes to an accuracy and a detailed standpoint. Asking whether, for example, a third party has an information security policy and then having a yes, no, partial type response. The yes could mean many things. Yes, they have one, but what is the quality of that content like? And the partial as well, you know, it leaves a lot of ambiguity around the quality or the level of maturity about that particular information security policy that we're asking for. So what we certainly push clients toward doing now is building out a set of requirements aligned to each of those types of questions to represent what we mean or what we feel is acceptable or considered good. So rather than having, do you have an information security policy? Yes, no, partial. Perhaps there we could say which of the following aspects are incorporated in your information security policy. And then we can detail out each of the things that we define as our standard for what's acceptable when looking at that type of information. Are we looking for them to have a particular content inside the information security policy? Are we looking to understand they have an owner and that it's communicated, and of course that it's reviewed as well? So being more descriptive about what we actually want from these questions leaves a lot less room for error when it comes back to accuracy of the data we're collecting. When it comes to the detail that we get within the content, the questionnaire content as well, there are a few techniques we can introduce. Certainly making sure that any of our questions have sufficient guidance text associated to them, making sure that we explain any terminology, making sure that we explain any acronyms that might be present within the question set, and of course making sure there's a sufficient route to go down should they have any problems with responding to particular areas of the questions as well. So enhancing that questionnaire quality, we'll do a few things to actually help the end-to-end process for managing your program. One is that it usually takes a third party less time to respond to question sets. They're obviously going to find it easier. You're going to get that data back better. It's going to be better quality and more accurate. And of course, we're saving time here. The more things that we can capture up front that's accurate and to the level of detail we need means the less times we have to engage with the third party afterwards to follow up on some of these areas where there may be grey areas within how they've responded, or blank answers or misinterpreted questions. So having that mature process in place around questionnaire quality will of course save on resource and make the process more efficient later on down the line as well. And the last point on there is around scoring and risk register output. It's all well and good having a good quality question set, but are we able to define some logic to identifying and automatically presenting some of these risk items to us off the back of it? So are there particular questions within your question set that are more important than others? Have you put in the measures to grade or apply some form of criticality to each of those weightings as well? What we would recommend, of course, introducing here is an impact times likelihood approach. Something where we're weighting the questions we're asking and we're looking at the level of maturity for the responses we get back. Using those in combination, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, we're able to start grading some of these questions and responses automatically. We then see all of the more critical findings, further up that list of a more itemized risk register. And it helps us prioritize again some of the review process, which of course improves on more of those efficiency tasks as well.
Thank you, Joe. So we've had a few questions come in while we've been talking about this. So I'll just address these briefly. And of course, we do have the Q&A section at the very end, but we've had a couple of questions just asking about the fourth party and concentration risks from the previous slides. So just to highlight that, as in how do we actually track that? So an assessment is definitely always the preferential route. The reason why is that if you use a technology to passively scan and identify the technologies that they use from a fourth party standpoint, it's going to be a limited list. You're going to get insight into the fact they use these SaaS technologies and O365, and who doesn't tend to use O365 or something similar these days. It's a somewhat useful list. But what really adds value is when you actually get the context from them directly. You need to really ask the vendors and say, usually for a supplementary assessment or something similar, where you ask, what are the fourth parties in scope for my contract or the services that you're providing? Again, you don't want the list of everything they do because most organizations will have multiple service lines that they're providing. So you can pinpoint and target the ones that actually are supporting your workflow. And some of that does feed into some of the privacy elements as well. So data protection, data transfers, understanding the flow of information as it moves around. And tied to that, as I did mention, usually assessments. We've had a couple of questions come in as well about how do we actually get the third parties and vendors to assess as we progress. Because I appreciate a lot of people can get resistance from them. And quite often the resistance we get back is, we've answered this 1,000 times in the last year to every other customer. I understand it is a repeated process and it's probably changed 5–10% between the different organizations. So the standard approach that we take on this is, let's try and make this as painless as possible for the suppliers and the vendors. I appreciate we're the customers and they're providing services for us, and you're usually going to get a good response when it comes to contract negotiations or at the procurement stage because they naturally want your contract and they want your money. But past that stage, they become very reluctant to. So first stage is making sure that you have contractual obligations for them to actually conduct this assessment in a manner that you're comfortable with. That's the by far the stick to the situation. The carrot being, use something that's going to make life more straightforward for them. Don't give them a spreadsheet where they've got to go through and interpret your language and logic. Ask them in a manner that is more palatable to them. So the way that we approach that personally is that we will use web interface. We'll use multiple choice or checkbox-based questions rather than yes, no. So we remove the ambiguity and that mind-numbing process of going through a spreadsheet and going yes, no, no, yes, no, as you go through 300 rows. I've done my fair share of those. And make it less of a meditative process for them. Make it interactive and wherever possible, give them information back. Don't just be a black hole where you take that data and you tick a box internally and you say, brilliant, we got their information. Try and make it interactive. Give them results, give them feedback. Highlight from a compliance standpoint, if you're able to map against it, what they're doing well and what they're doing badly. If it's approached that way, then they're seeing some value against it. I appreciate they might be doing similar activities internally anyway, but if it's painless or as painless as it can be, and you're giving feedback and something that's actually useful to them as a return, then you're more likely to get some interaction from them. So that carrot and stick approach of contracts and making that process seamless certainly helps. So what are the observations we normally see from a content standpoint? Now, content risks, the most common issue we see, so 52% of organizations who we've conducted this maturity assessment against, and just to reiterate, we've done it with Goliaths of industry down to small organizations across multiple verticals here. 52% of them did not have a standard way to present risk data. Now, this may sound surprising because most people would think, well, they have a risk register of some description, a spreadsheet, a tool, or whatever it may be. But a centralized risk register is more than just a information security risk register. It's something that's universal across the organization. It's a similar model or process that's being followed across, say, privacy, business continuity, and so on. So it's looking at the gamut of information you're capturing across from the vendor, and can we consistently standardize it in some shape or format? The value on that is that you're all speaking the same language, you're interacting with the vendor in the same way, and that third party is just generally going to find that a more palatable approach. So we do strongly recommend when we speak to customers who have this issue that we work on building a centralized risk register, consolidating data wherever we can, and making sure that it's consistent. So moving on to our next sphere, so roles and responsibilities. Joe, if you'd be so kind.
Sure. So now we move on to the nuts and bolts and the operational aspect of actually making the program work. We need to align the right resource and the right representatives, and of course the right skill sets to the task at hand. The first thing to look at here is whether you have a dedicated team responsible for managing the program. I appreciate that if you do not have many third parties, the slice of resource that you're going to need to cater for the program is considerably less. But we do actually find that even organizations with a larger scale of third parties do not have dedicated resource to managing the program. Because of that, there has to be compromise. It means you're either reviewing less risks, you're assessing less third parties, or you'll not be able to perform some of the more mature-based tasks like managing content properly, or of course being able to report the right information up the chain as well. So ensuring that you have enough resource for the task in hand is obviously something quite important. There are a few ways of doing this. We have tools internally that allow us to look at your program goals, how many third parties you would like to assess, how much time is spent on each of the individual program tasks, and it allows you to forecast exactly what type of resource you're going to need internally and how many hours you have to dedicate to the program on a monthly or yearly basis to meet your program goals. If you don't have enough resource, you can quite easily forecast that there's going to be a problem. And at that point, you can weigh up whether you need more resource to invest in the program, or you have to compromise and reduce some of the scope of your program goals to make them realistic. We're also commonly finding that not every program has a dedicated owner associated to it. So ensuring you have someone accountable for making some of those decisions around defining content, what the scope of third parties are, what the program goals look like, is of course something that is important and helps the program function and operate. Surprisingly, operational manuals are a bit of a rarity from the organisations we've assessed so far. This operational manual is a guidebook on how the different aspects of the workflow for managing a program day to day should operate. It includes the process flows for the onboarding, the communication approach, the assessment content guidelines, how you would go about reviewing and remediating risk items, all the way through to the types of reporting templates that are required as well. To support each of those operational workflows, there should be a clear guideline on exactly who is performing each of those tasks and what the level of involvement is as well in each of the activities. So we recommend using some form of RACI model there to support each of those workflows, so we know where the lines are and the boundaries are in terms of who's doing what. Of course, there should be an owner dedicated to that type of manual as well, someone to make sure it's up to date. And touching on the resource point that I referred to during the content pillar overview, the more we define a robust process here, the more we get a good gauge on how many third parties we can assess each month or across the course of the year. So standardizing this process, making sure people are doing the right tasks at the right time, really allows us to build a benchmark on what can be accomplished. So making sure we standardize this as much as possible, communicate it out and train people in the right way will of course make sure that we can start to get some good metrics on how the program is working. As I just touched on there, the operation manual should serve as a real key training point for the rest of the program. If there is a new starter for whatever role within the program, this operation manual would serve as that guidebook for how to act, how they should engage with third parties, when they should communicate and how they should communicate with them. And of course, as we touched on, where the boundaries of their roles and responsibilities lie within the program too. We are often finding as well that some of the incorrect roles might be aligned to programs. So what we recommend doing is aligning the operational based tasks of a program to the more analyst based roles within the team. And anyone who's touching on remediation activities and might require the subject matter expertise is aligned to those more subject matter expertise based roles within the program, like risk reviews or remediation. If you're able to segregate who's doing what, you're of course aligning the right resource to the right tasks, and as well as that becoming a good way of standardizing your approach, it allows you to build up some metrics of what teams at capacity is aligned to what, and of course it allows you to start resource forecasting for the future. So getting that understanding of how many risks can be reviewed by a subject matter expert per month, how many hours they're dedicating to the program, it all builds up that profile of maturity from a roles and responsibilities standpoint.
Fantastic, Joe. Thank you. That was lovely. So moving on to some of the common observations. Before I highlight these, we've actually had a question come in about equating risks to financial costs, so risk quantification. Now, touching on the centralized risk register point that we made earlier on, just to highlight that, as in risk quantification is certainly useful, but the main challenge we see when it comes to third-party programs is that to establish an accurate or meaningful financial calculation that you can hang your proverbial hat on means you need to have the right level of context. So you need to be able to populate enough information about yourselves internally as an organization, as in where are you in your vertical, what is your size, what is your function, how are you regulated, etc. Now that's reasonable, that's understandable for you to manage internally, but the amount of context you need from the third party is substantial. So as much as we are proponents of risk quantification, and we are, the reality is that by far and large, the most organizations we speak to are not in a position to populate the right amount of context against a third party to determine what it is that they're doing, and therefore what is the associated potential financial impact of their activities, be it tied to revenue generating activities or otherwise. So organizations at the upper echelons of the maturity scale certainly can start looking at risk quantification. And I think that's a valid progression, and is certainly a talking point for governance when we come onto that and we talk about stakeholders of the program and speaking their proverbial language. But the reality is the vast majority of organizations we speak to would not be in a position just yet to accurately calculate financial costs, regardless of the Monte Carlo calculations that they may use. So tying back to some of the observations here that we're actually seeing against roles and responsibilities. We've got a couple of metrics for you this time. 62% lack a standardized process. Now, this ties back to the operations manual point that Joe was highlighting earlier on. And a standardized process for us should be documented. It should be RACI. You should have roles defined and the various activities and who's consulted, etc., mapped out. But a reasonable percentage of people are so-called winging it. They're simply bringing new people on board. They'll evolve as they go along. They'll do their best. People will leave. Process will change, etc. The challenge on that is you haven't got a consistent metric year on year in order to compare results. So we do strongly recommend that the process is standardized, just if anything, for personnel churn. 52% had resource planning shortfalls. Now, quite often this is people being overly optimistic around what they're going to be able to achieve. They'll start out the year and say, right, we've got X number of personnel. We're going to conduct 4,000 assessments of third parties this year. That's brilliant. But what they're not necessarily considering is all the intricate pieces that contribute to that. Who do they need to involve across the business? Are there subject matter experts they need to involve? Are there business owners who own the relationships with the third party? And so on. So these are all time-consuming efforts, and in reality take more time than you'd expect for a subset. So quite often there's resource planning shortfalls where they're not able to get through the volume. And that's not purely just on the vendors' interactions and the third-party interactions and the delays we mentioned earlier on in getting them to respond, but also those internal various contributors which slow down the process. 59% overspend on TPRM resources. So even though they have resource planning shortfalls, in the sense where they haven't got the right amount of capacity, they are, in some cases, overspending on resource. Now, what we mean by this is that you may have somebody who's a higher skilled and higher cost center to the business, working on activities that they wouldn't necessarily need to do. A lower skilled resource would be able to accommodate it. So if you're putting out your InfoSec or your CISO or your senior roles of the business, and they're sitting there trawling through results as opposed to looking at output of results and risks and issues, that's not a good use of time. So a reasonable amount of percentage of organizations are using senior tier resources on activities which could either be automated or delegated down to an individual who may be at a cheaper cost center for the business, which we found to be quite interesting. So moving on to remediation. Joe.
Thanks, Alastair. So now that we have defined our content, we've aligned our resources, we start to get data back into the team for review. So the first thing that we would need to look at is the process around reviewing submissions that come back from third parties. What we're finding is there's not typically a standardized process for reviewing these responses after they're submitted. So what qualifying steps take place to make sure that data is accurate and ready to progress onto a review or remediation phase? So certainly some of the things that we would recommend introducing are firstly a basic review of the quality and completeness of the set of responses that come back. This would typically be ensuring that the right questions have been responded to. You've got responses aligned to every single particular question you've asked, making sure any notes that have been provided as to support any questions have been provided are fit for purpose and relevant. And any attachment files or evidence uploads, of course, meet the required guidance as well. So having that standardized for your questionnaire content, your master questionnaire content, ensures that that's going to be a repeatable process for the team to manage. Once you've done that aspect of the approach and you've performed any rejection and repeat processes to get the information to the level where you need it to be, you can then move on to looking at the findings from a more risk standpoint. So looking at the types of responses you got back, using some of the question scoring logic to define how you should start to prioritize risks for review, reviewing them to find out exactly how these should be reviewed internally, and of course, building out a remediation approach that's standardized as well. One thing we are pushing clients toward doing is not just asking questions, getting the responses back and then leaving those actions down to interpretation, but actually defining again some form of standardized logic on what to do if you get this type of response. So referring back to my example earlier on, if they said no, they didn't have an information security policy, maybe you can already define up front what the next step in that review and remediation approach should be. What would the guidance be? When would you expect it by? And what sort of quality would you expect as well? Having that type of process defined means that if we refer back to the previous roles and responsibilities side, we can start aligning some of these first pass remediation and review activities to the more operational and analyst-based roles within the business. We don't have to have subject matter experts to look at all of these findings if we can align some basic logic and standardized process to giving a first pass through that review process of the risks. Lastly, when we look at the remediation resource requirements, this ties again back into roles and responsibilities slightly, but making sure that we build up some accurate metrics on how long it takes to review the types of risks that we're commonly finding, what the review process looks like end to end, so that we can start forecasting and capacity planning for further remediation efforts. And as I touched on earlier as well, although we're building out this if this then that type logic for the types of questions that we're asking, having the type of process defined for remediation is of course very important. So not just for the remediation aspect with third parties, but also that submission quality and completeness review approach as well. Making sure each of these types of workflows features within the operations manual, has the right steps and the right gates in place of how to actually progress through the workflow end to end, and all of the correct alignment of resources supported by a RACI model as well to ensure it's carried out to the most mature and repeatable manner.
Great, thank you, Joe. So some of the most common observations we see in this space, so remediation, 86%, so a very significant amount here, had inconsistent remediation guidelines. So this is how they were going to respond and react to results as they come in. So what I mean here is that they're not actually standardizing it. So you may have different parts of the business analyzing different data in different ways and different roles analyzing the data in different ways. But that's fine, but as long as it's consistent enough that we can hang our hat on it and review it year on year and make sure it's consistent, then we will be good. 59% had incomplete risk scoring mechanisms. So however you calculate this, whether it's likelihood by impact or using NIST models, risk itself needs to be, again, mapped in some shape or form. We need to understand what is the impact based on what that vendor or third party is actually doing. It's not going to be universal across the entire estate. And then determine based on whatever information we can collate, whether it's monitoring tools, risk assessments, etc., how likely that's going to be. So a surprising percentage don't actually have a normalized and standardized risk scoring mechanism. So a likelihood and impact or similar model. And what we normally find when it comes to risk remediation is that while we all strive to build something that's can withstand the test of time and looks fantastic to look at, it doesn't really need to be your magnum opus. The most effective programs that we've seen from a remediation standpoint are simple and therefore are able to scale. The more complex it is, the more difficult it's going to be to scale, and the more it's going to fall apart as you do try and do so. So we do strongly recommend that we cover off this information in a bit more detail. So we do recommend that when we go through remediation, we make sure that we are tracking and establishing recommendations in line with what the business expects to see. So from a governance standpoint, what we are looking to see for governance is being able to articulate things to the right resources of the business effectively. So from an individual reporting standpoint, how are we going to report back the various roles and responsibilities and the progress, the KPIs of the day-to-day activities? So what I mean by that is, are we doing assessments? If so, how many assessments have we actually distributed? Are we on track for hitting our targets? Are we hitting the right amount of the organization and the third parties that we deal with on a day-to-day basis? Or is it a small subset? Are we reporting back statistics on that small subset, which may be misleading compared to the broader audience? An example would be, I'm assessing 10% of the business, third-party estate, and then I'm reporting back that we have a high level of risk across our third-party estate. Well, if that's only against 10%, we need to articulate that as part of our governance processes. We need to escalate the right KPIs back to the program sponsors and stakeholders. From a program reporting standpoint, so I obviously spoke about some of the scope there and the breadth of it, but again, we need to be very, very succinct in highlighting what we're covering. Is it just information security? Is it business continuity? How often are we conducting these assessments, etc.? Now, this can all feed into a risk committee and steering group. So a risk committee here is usually a cross-section of different roles of the business. I've mentioned some of the more comprehensive third-party programs incorporate business resilience, continuity, IT, information security, privacy, legal, procurement. All of these have a vested interest in managing these third parties. They should be involved in some shape or form in a risk committee or steering group. Now, we normally recommend quarterly reviews, which could also take the results of a maturity assessment. Now, the maturity reviews feed into that because they give a broader insight into the program. What are we doing well? What have we not done well? Where can we improve? And of course, audit is a factor on that. So the audit teams, if you have an audit team, for the organizations that do, they'll want to see how you've matured against your maturity assessment, what you're doing, and collect demonstrative evidence against that. So those steering groups, risk committee minutes and sessions, and the reporting on the KPIs of the program all feed into that. Okay. So what are the observations we tend to see on governance? Is that 69% were missing strategic reporting opportunities. So this is where they're actually capturing information on third parties, but not necessarily reporting it back to the business. Now, reporting it back certainly helps because you're able to allocate more budget, justify budget spends, justify resource, etc., and actually fix the issues that we're finding. Now, a large percentage are not being able to collate the information they've got into a cohesive summary that they can present. Now, the good questions earlier on about risk quantification, turning it into a financial number, that can certainly help because you're talking the same language and you can say, if we don't fix this, it's going to cost us X dollars. And then that has meaning and that's justifiable rather than a risk score where we say, this is a risk score of 20 to the organization. Most senior execs may just sort of shrug their shoulders. If you tell them they have a red risk, then they'll probably be more concerned. Now, that's not to undermine, of course, their capabilities. It's just the exposure of what they're dealing with in the business. It needs to be commensurate with what they're having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So what we normally recommend here is, of course, risk quantification is an approach, but alternatively, what you can do is start saying, we cover X% of the organization. This is what we know. This is what we don't know. This is what could happen if something happens, as everyone sees on the news about the various breaches, third-party events and so on. So you've got to make it into an unknown question. We know this much, these are the problems we know, and this is what we don't know. Are you going to accept that, or are we going to get more budget in order to go and find out what we don't know? 59% struggle to get an overview of third-party risk. So this is a case where they don't actually have much insight into what's happening. They look at silos of third parties. So it could be a small subset. It could be just looking at information security or privacy and so on. And they're not building this comprehensive or 360-degree view on what's happening. So that should apply at a third-party level and rolling up into categories of third parties, rolling up further into tiers and business function, and then rolling up into your overall posture. I appreciate that sounds overwhelming for people who don't have any of that, but if you're consistent and you have a clear and simple metrics for calculating what a third party is and what their risk level is, and a nice, simple, scalable mechanism, then it is more straightforward than it may seem. Now, we'll come on to some of these questions in just a moment, but a few closing points before we go to our Q&A is that when it comes to the prioritization of improvements, what we're really looking to do is identify the weaknesses on the back of a maturity assessment. We want to be able to associate what the impact is to the relevant parts of the business and then prioritize what our weaknesses need to be resolved first. So what are the foundation layers that we need to focus on that are going to improve risk across our third-party program? And of course, a contributing factor here should be the level of effort to implement. If we go and prioritize the top few and then find out they take 12 months to implement, yet we have something in number 4 that takes 1 month, then naturally you're going to want to approach those low-hanging fruit areas first. Once we know what they are, we can look at planning and ownership, so we can start establishing realistic timeframes and expectations. We can set our maturity score objectives on what we actually want to try and achieve. And then we could define improvement tasks for various roles and allocate ownership to those. Now, we don't need to do one component at a time. We quite often set out an objective per area. So each of those pillars, we define a simple objective to achieve per quarter and work through them that way, and then break them down into phases where necessary. As part of our quarterly reviews on the maturity assessments and sessions, we would normally look at the results and see how we're progressing against those. So finally, appreciate it's not easy getting everybody in harmony when it comes to third-party management because there's so many players involved in the process. But if we keep it clean, simple, straightforward, it can be cohesive, and we can get some semblance of a program running. So for the last 5-6 minutes or so, we've got a few questions coming in, so please feel free to send over any additional questions that you've got. Now is the time. So to start off with the first, we've got some information here. Sorry, we do of course have, as I'm going through some of these Q&A points, we do have a couple of poll-based questions that we appreciate if you could answer. So firstly, if you're looking to augment or establish your third-party risk program in the next several months, please do let us know. In the meantime, we do have a question about, as a business associate of a covered entity, healthcare provider, is there justification to exclude the covered entity from completing a third-party risk assessment? Now, normally we wouldn't actually have a justification for excluding it. There needs to be a justification, of course, why, but we would normally recommend including those. Now, it could be that it's a limited assessment. It doesn't need to be the nth degree, and of course, you may have a risk tolerance that reflects that. We would recommend, at least from a due diligence standpoint, addressing it partially. So having a short form supplementary assessment that's going to address the need. Good question. Now we've got another question here. So if an organization has a recent SOC report with high marks, can this substitute a third-party risk assessment? That's a very good question, and one that comes up quite often. So quite often when we send out an assessment to organizations, we'll get back a SOC 2 report or an ISO 27001 statement of applicability. Now these are great, but someone needs to sit there and actually interpret them to some shape or form. Most organizations that would send these, or a lot of them, wouldn't even address your own assessment. They'll just pass that off to you and say, these are our standard T's and C's, accept it. And I understand that. So we can see those as acceptable, assuming you have the resource internally to be able to process it. We try and limit the amount that we get down to a few percent, as in sub 5%, just because of the associated effort in interpreting it. And that's actually quite realistic. It's actually a small subset that would actually push back and not map it into it. But there are, of course, additional questions that we get and we have to ask based on that data. So if it's a SOC 2 report or a 27001 assessment, you want to understand the scope, the statement of applicability. Does it cover off all the services they provide? Have they got defined and addressable owners? You'd want to dive into the scope and qualify the information that you get on the back of it. That's a very good question. And we've got a question here. I'll ask Joe if you could address this, which is, if I don't necessarily have all the resources in-house, I'm a small organization here, I assume, to be able to address third parties, should my operations manuals just be focused on myself?
Yeah, if there are resource shortfalls, I would recommend that, of course, you should start to build on the efficiencies as much as possible of the program so that you can start to accommodate more of the scope of third parties you might need to. So as we've discussed, there are several ways of improving that efficiency, whether it's improving the quality and the user experience of actually completing an assessment, whether you've got the ability to enroll some form of automated platform, of course, to automate as much of these mechanisms as possible. It allows you to get an easier grasp and, of course, expand on the scope of the program in as short a time as possible.
Great, thank you, Joe. I've got another question here about program pillars, as in, do they have varying weights when you look at a third-party risk program, or are they treated equally? Good question. So no, we would not necessarily treat them equally, or at least the contributing elements that make up that pillar. A good example may be that if you're looking at for example, your risk remediation program, that is certainly very valid and important. But if your scope is so small to the point where you're only dealing with 5% of your third party estate, the fact that you have a fantastic risk remediation program doesn't really stack up. It's going to be heavily weighted by your scope, your coverage, etc. So when we actually build these programs and these maturity programs, we do weight the questions that contribute to those differently. Now, the pillars are important and they all have some value of importance, but normally it's the scope and the depth is something that we deem to be particularly important there. So before we ask our final question, we do have a final poll for you here as well. So if you would like to get access to one of our maturity assessments, we can talk to you about how they actually function. We do offer free maturity assessments as well. So you can actually go through the process and see how our pillars actually function. By all means, please feel free to comment in the poll, and we'll be able to follow up with you at your leisure. And there's no commitments, there's no fee associated to doing any of our maturity assessments. So we've got a final question here around governance and who is normally actually owning the third-party management program. It's a very good question. Normally we see responsibility ultimately falling under the chief, the COO's office more than anything else. So if you've got a data protection officer, quite often they'd be heavily invested in the third-party management program from a privacy standpoint, but normally it goes COO or CIO, depending on the organizational structure, then CISO in some shapes or form, but it's very information-led, very information-centric. And one last question here is, you've obviously mentioned that remediation can be and should be kept simple. What do you mean? What we mean by that is that we should have clear-cut guidance and recommendations defined for the third parties, so they understand what our risk tolerance is. We should be transparent with them. So we should be able to highlight to them and say, this is what we expect from you. This is what we would pass and would do business with you. So I'd have clear-cut recommendations as part of your remediation process and establishing that up front. So you can have different tiers of users articulating that information back to the third party. And the other aspect of that remediation process being simplified is by making sure that you have that standard risk interpretation model. You know, a likelihood by impact score, risk quantification, whatever it is, make sure it's simple enough that you can repeat it, get a calculation, simplify it, automate it, whether it's using a platform or spreadsheets, however you look at it, so that you can analyze data from your third parties cleanly and easily. You know, get an assessment back, get monitoring information, and be able to simply turn that into a risk. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for today, but thank you very much, everybody, for joining the webinar. And thank you very much, Joe, for your time and contributions. It's been very enlightening. If you do have any other questions for us, please feel free to reach out to us. Again, we'd be happy to provide a maturity assessment for you all if you would like us to. But otherwise, we hope you found value in today, and we appreciate it, and we hope you have a fantastic rest of your days. And thank you all.